Guys, welcome. Where's Europe headed? It's a big question. Europe is a very confusing place, and we have 42 minutes to be exact to talk about this question. We did, have some preliminary preparations to guide us through this topic, and we'll start with Matthew. Matthew, can you tell us a little bit about your story? Because I think you're an American with European roots. You now live in Eastern Europe, so you have the inside and the outside look, and you can start us off, I think.
Sure. So Matthew Mežinskis, American Latvian, representing, I guess, the Eastern Northern European contingency here, along with Ioni. Just very quickly about me, I've done a podcast for about 6 years, and I blog about macro and money at Porkopolis Economics. So I think this is the right conference for that. And we were talking about, it's quite a broad topic if you want to talk about where Europe is going at the beginning here, but if you just look at the public markets, just to kind of put things in perspective, there's a lot of markets that Bitcoin is going to be a part of, right? So I'm going to name a couple. These are publicly traded companies and worldwide figures, and we can see where Europe fits in. So the oil and gas industry, Bitcoin's definitely going to be disrupting that. That's about $7 trillion worth of revenue. North America has about 35 to 40% of that share. Europe, EU companies have 10%. Okay, what about tech? That's about $5 trillion worth of revenue a year, $5 trillion. North America has about 60% of that. Europe has 5%. Mining, regular mining, resource mining, that's about $1 trillion industry. Gold is about 20% of that, but $1 trillion industry. North America is like 20, 25%. Europe represents 3% of that. And Bitcoin mining. Now we get to the smallest dollar figure, but clearly this won't be in the future. That's a $10 billion industry. $10 billion trailing 12-month mining revenue per year. It's actually a little bit less right now. There are no European publicly trading companies. It's 0%. I did speak with Jan from Brains yesterday. I was asking him, of course we know that there are European miners a lot in the north. He thinks maybe it could be 15% is the latest figure of European miners, but you're still looking at 35% in North America. So again, I don't know, how broad do we want to go here? 500 years ago, what was the market share of Europe in the global economy? 90%?
But
so it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity, obviously, in Bitcoin in this sector, and Europe is not doing too well in all the other sectors.
Okay, so now we know that Europe is not doing too well right now, but we are going to end on a positive note today, and we are going to talk about Bitcoin being a chance for Europe to find its footing again. I know that, Rahim, you know more about the history of, basically everything, but also Europe than I do, a lot more. How do we end up here? What's the special role that Europe has been playing and is playing right now?
Well, the major problem of Europe nowadays, it has an inheritance problem. If you inherit too much capital, you may be inclined to just consume it off and enjoy your days around. It had a different problem in the 20th century, the big catastrophe of the 20th century, which was it got impatient. It was running ahead, you're right, it was a big share of global wealth production, leading in science, arts, technology. Fortunately, from the catastrophe of the 20th century, we had an offspring before, a European offspring, which is the US, and has been attracting the more pioneering, more entrepreneurial people ever since, and was a kind of refuge. And European ideas, of course, have been flourishing, and I think the central heritage that we can take from Europe is there is an approach to development which is more based on decentralized innovation and a network, kind of a network character where it's not all centralized in one distributing agency, in one big party, one big committee, one big emperor. but it's a dispersed structure. And so there is, I think, an underrated European heritage in the world today. A lot of the catch-up growth we've seen in the 21st century, which is historically amazing, the amount of wealth that has been produced, the technological advances we've had as well, and how many billions of people have been lifted out of a life of misery. And I think that's to a large extent by learning from the failure of centralized models and being compared, in particular in China, being compared to Hong Kong and Singapore, right on your border, more or less. And of course, Hong Kong and Singapore are at least partly European, and they have a strong European heritage in exactly that kind of tradition that goes back to the old city-state tradition of past.
But I see two main points here. One is that Europe is not just the landmass that we are sitting on right now. It's also an idea that we exported to the US that is now, coming back to haunt us, at least economically. And the second question would be centralized versus decentralized. So how centralized is Europe right now? Because we have nation states, and then we have even like almost city states or very, very small nation states. And then we have the European Union in Brussels trying to centralize everything. But is there something that is actually happening? And is this a problem?
The big advantage of Europe is that our politicians are less competent on average. That's like the last thing. That's really strong. Because if they were more competent, of course, we have the centralizing tendency. Having less competent politicians means there's relatively more competence in the private sector compared to other places, and that's still the strong point about Europe. So yes, we have the centralizing tendencies, but those people in power usually employ armadas of consultants because they lack the kind of crucial competence. So I think it's much more worrying what's happening in China, where you don't have this kind of career politicians, but more engineers, people with a relatively higher competence, which of course may lead to the idea that you can manage it, that you can manage a whole continent. In Europe we have this idea, but it's much easier to ridicule it. If you see the kind of politicians claiming to manage the continent and you hear them speak and you listen to their ideas, you realize it's much easier to ridicule, it's much easier to troll them on Twitter than it would be in China, for example.
Well, but if you try and troll, politicians in China, they come and pick you up, right? That's not ideal in any scenario. Ioni, you come from Sweden, right? In Austria, when we want to look at a country where everything's working great, we always talk about the Nordic countries, about Sweden. Is the Swedish model something to strive for, or rather not?
No.
No, okay, great.
So my name is Ioni Appelberg. I am from Sweden. I'm a Bitcoiner, I'm a YouTuber, a medical doctor, and author. It's frankly amazing to see all these Bitcoiners here. I'm just blown away by it all. So yeah, when people talk about the Swedish model, it is often a reference to our socialist heritage, which I think developed in a time where it served us quite well. And now we have a relatively stable government, and we have one of the happiest nations in the world. We have a fairly stable economy. And the thing is, this has served us quite well up until now. I don't think that this is the way forward. We have a pretty stable ground to move forward, but we are reluctant to, because we are now in a situation where people trust the government, they trust the money, and I believe that a lot of people will fare ill because of this. My role in Bitcoin, as I've taken on personally, is to look further into the future than most other Bitcoiners do. That's what I try. That's the niche I'm trying to occupy, to look into the 500,000, 2,000 years ahead, because no one is really exploring that area because it's ethereal. So it all depends on how far into the future that we want to look, right? And Europe is already under quite significant evolutionary pressure to change. It is poised to change beyond recognition at some point in time. And I believe it is for the better, but I'm not sure that Sweden is going to follow suit, because we are stuck with the old model. So in the short term, sure, Sweden is a great place, but in the longer term, I think it could be quite dangerous to be in Sweden.
Do you think that if we really look into the future, I think you said like what, 500 to 1,000 years, so that's
Yes.
a very long time, and it's also good to be specialized and look in 500 years into the future, because no one can call you out if you're wrong. But in let's say 500 years, does Sweden still exist?
No. Well, it depends on what you mean by exist. The territory is going to exist. Sweden as an idea might not, I'm not sure. But what I am quite sure about is that I believe that we will see a rise of micronations across Europe, or sovereign state projects might be a better term, and possibly a Balkanization as well. And to make this argument, I might need to provide a few definitions. So first, micronations are small, self-proclaimed political entities that claim sovereignty and are often unrecognized by established governments. They have their own flags, they have their own currencies, their own constitutions, their own postage stamps, their own territorial claims. And we have a few examples of these already, right? Some early examples. We have, for example, Sealand in the North Sea, east of UK. We have Freetown, Christiania in Denmark, which I visited myself a few times. Very cozy place. And then there's the Hutt River province in Australia. And these old micronations, the motivation behind these was a desire for political autonomy and alternative governance, and to experiment with or to establish an experimental society. And in recent years, we are seeing the rise of new types of micronations. And these include, for example, Asgardia, which aims to be the first space-based nation. Cool project. Then we also have, the most famous example might be Liberland, and you may think whatever you want about Liberland, but it's still a project that speaks to the direction we're going. And then there are seasteading communities that propose an ocean-based living. And we might also see Balkanization, which is different from the rise of micronation. Balkanization is the fragmentation of a larger state or a larger
So that
territory.
would be what would happen if the European Union were to dissolve first. Balkanization would be going back to the old concept of nation states that we had before.
Exactly.
Which is also a bit of a danger, because nation states like to fight themselves. I mean, there is the European Union. You can criticize whatever you want about the European Union, but the idea of not, France and Germany not going to war every 10 years is probably a good one.
Yes, yes. And Balkanization, it has this connotation that it's often a violent, very unpleasant event. And it might have been with examples like the disintegration of former Yugoslavia. Then Brexit is another type of example. Then I wouldn't call the breakup of Czechoslovakia a Balkanization, because that happened. It was a friendly breakup. I'm sure it was very tumultuous and unpleasant for a lot of people, but it was not a war. So it worked out quite well in the end. But then we have possible future examples, including Catalonia and Kurdistan. So these things might happen as well. But the thing is that we have Bitcoin, which is a driving force for the rise of micronations and possibly also Balkanization, because Bitcoin, as decentralized, borderless money, it is going to facilitate the formation of micronations or these sovereign state projects. Only when Bitcoin is involved in the process, we call them Bitcoin citadels. And I believe that we will see the rise of Bitcoin citadels. I know Rahim has quite a few excellent points on this.
I'm just waiting to contradict you. Go on.
Yeah, sure.
I want to bring up some controversy now.
Yeah, sure. I'm looking forward to it. It's all fun and games. So Bitcoin, I think that these Bitcoin citadels could become economically and politically very powerful because they're going to attract businesses, they're going to attract investments, and they're, while remaining self-sufficient and independent of traditional financial structures. So they will have their own trade partners. They will probably be quite unaffected by economic sanctions. So yeah, well, this might be a good point.
I do want to jump back to the Europe of 2023 in a second, but I'll give Rahim the chance to put in some controversy right now.
No, first I'll go back to your initial question, and then I'll contradict him. The question was, about Sweden, but you can ask it about almost any Western European country. And I think one of the most important heritage has been a very invisible kind of capital, and it's cultural capital. And a form of this cultural capital is it's high trust societies. But having high trust societies means it's relatively easier to generate wealth by collaboration, and it still is a large part of the European capital structure. Of course, it also has a downside, and the way towards this kind of high trust societies was homogenization, ethnic cleansing, wars, and we had to collaborate through adversity certain amount of times. And of course, you had artificial identities created by the centralized nation states. It was a relative success model with a terrible downside, and we don't want to go back at. The big advantage is the centralization project never finished. There was never one nation powerful enough to rule them all. We still have this diversity, much less than we used to have. So the ethnic cleansing went a long way, unfortunately. It isn't completed yet, so I'd be very worried about further Balkanization, because Balkanization basically means you have a dispersed pattern of different ethnic and religious groups living right next to each other, which tends to be an advantage. So it's difficult to centralize, but of course, if you really want it, it means ethnic cleansing, and that's not completely finished. So we still have like some issues if the ethnic card is played, and I'd be worried about that. So I don't think Balkanization is something positive. The real small autonomous entities were always overlapping jurisdictions in a sense. They were not territorial exclusive, unless it's really the citadel, the protective fortification of the city where you find refuge. And it's a mixed society. It's a society where people spend part of their lives, where you have Italians and Germans and Czech living in the same city with different functions, coming from different histories, where people are coming from. I wouldn't mention micronations there. I think micronations largely are LARPing, kind of role-playing. And I think there's a connection to the high trust. That's why I wanted to start with it. A sign of a high trust society is you can rule those societies with a letterhead alone. You just send letters to people and tell them what to do, and they say, oh, wow, I got the letterhead, the official one, I got to do it immediately, because, of course, I trust the institutions. Of course, this trust has been abused a lot, but I think that's still the idea of like having the letterheads and this kind of self-proclaimed sovereignty. I think it's a kind of LARPing, and it works best in high trust societies. I wouldn't compare it to the small jurisdictions that have survived the feudal era, like Liechtenstein, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino. It's great that they're still around. I don't think they would emerge again in a pattern we have, so they're historical accidents. In most cases, they were too small to be cared about, so they were just forgotten by history. They are leftovers of this decentralized feudal order. But having the kind of special zones, of course, is something very modern, and it's a thing in 2023. I mean, what puts the European Union apart from other places of the planet is it's the only area in the world where you're not allowed to have a special economic zone. Nowadays we have 5,000-6,000 special economic zones, most in Asia, and of course that's part of the idea that...
Wait, can you just elaborate on this? We're not allowed to have special economic zones?
Yeah, it's part of the EU treaties. You can have this kind of legal diversity because it's supposed to be a zero-sum thing, which I don't believe. and it's all about harmonization and equalizing, standardizing, and so on. So you can't have this kind of special economic sense in a meaningful sense, and of course you can have a special administrative zone, which would be even better, which could have even a different legal setting. But that's the European heritage, and even though it has been taken up by the Emirates, which are a remainder of the British Empire and very European in that setting, has been taken up of this idea as a kind of legal diversity, that the territory doesn't have to be 100% match of certain static laws that reflect a certain ethnicity or religious belief. So even in deeply Islamic countries, you can have particular zones which are attractive to people from the outside, because you need outside capital and knowledge and skills. And it's this kind of diversity that was European and that very much brought about the European Renaissance and turned Europe from a relative backwater to the leading part of the world in science and culture and technology.
But the question is, if it's micronations or not or Balkanization or I don't know what, but the question for us, if we want a positive view of the future, it seems like we need to change courses from harmonizing everything to actually having this diversity that we have by default anyway, but how do we get there?
Yeah, but the diversity is increasing, I'd say. Of course, you have the centralizing tendency, but they're becoming more and more irrelevant. And then usually it's pain that leads to change. And we've had some pain, so that even, it seems hopeless, the kind of centralized money distribution, but we've seen countries, usually dysfunctional countries, trying to become more welcoming. Like Italy, for example, has changed its tax law to become more attractive. Portugal was able to attract a lot of Bitcoiners by having a relatively better legal situation. Of course, some things go to the worst, but overall, I'd say the diversity is increasing and will be increasing, but it will be increasing through pain and then following role models.
Okay, one very quick question, then we go to Matthew. Do you think that the European Union is going to end? Is it just going to disappear? Are we going to get rid of the blue flag?
If we can learn something from history, usually creatures like this don't disappear. The Roman Empire never disappeared. It's still there. It's still there. There's still people claiming a continuity, and the narrative is there. It's irrelevant. So most people don't even know about it, that there's this continuity, and it's different geopolitical actors who claim actually continuity to the Roman Empire. It became irrelevant.
But the Soviet Union,
parts of it became a joke.
But the Soviet Union actually was ended, right?
Yeah, that's the question. It's like, is the principle of the Tsar-led protector of Western civilization and Christianity and the Roman continuity? I think there's still a strong part of the Russian narrative is still a continuity from Byzantium. Which you see, and of course in the Soviet phase it was a different point to make. It's not so much the Christianity, it's the secularized form of this heresy. Socialism, which of course is a Christian heresy, but was meant to be like the all-replacing new religion, and then you have the protective power for this all-replacing state religion of socialism. But I'd say there's similar continuities. And another continuity, which is little known, is Turkey, as the successor of the Ottoman Empire, and the neo-Ottomanism of Erdogan is meant as a continuity of the narrative of a Roman Empire, which is like the center of a civilization.
But there is a difference, and then I'm going to stop this, but there's a difference between having a narrative, a continuity somewhere, and actually paying people to sit around in Brussels. So is this going to stop within our lifetime, or are we just going to do that?
Oh no, they'll still, you'll always find reasons to have conferences in Brussels.
No, not conferences.
And someone to pay for your hotel and have a nice time in Brussels. You always find reasons for they it'll be irrelevant to most people.
Okay. Matthew, you live in Eastern Europe, right? And it's not a nice thing to have this still in your mind, like where the Iron Curtain was before, but it's just, the history of the 20th century, the second part of the 20th century of Eastern Europe and Western Europe is very different. And me being a non-communist, I prefer the approach of Eastern Europe because they know what they get into, while in Western Europe, there's still a lot of, extreme leftist ideas. Well, right now in Austria, we have a Marxist as the head of the Social Democrat Party. Nobody cares, but whatever. Basically, how is life in Lithuania compared to maybe the US even?
Yeah.
And is there something we can learn there?
Yep. I know we're trying to cover hundreds of years and a lot of culture here, and I know we want to get back to Bitcoin, and I have some banking stats too I want to talk about, as I said at the beginning. But yes, as far as Eastern Europe goes, I mean, my family heritage was very much affected by the Soviets, and this is still affected today. We see the Ukraine war. I mean, in the Baltics, they're taking, and Poland, of course, taking the most Ukrainian refugees. I know the Czechs are very, very strong supporters of Ukraine. This is obviously a big issue that hasn't stopped over 100 years. And if power or state power means something, I can always hark back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth 200 years ago, which was the biggest state in Europe for 400 years. If it's a good thing to have power, I don't think necessarily we've solved this problem. And we also have the nuclear problem, which is always just going to, this sort of, whether it's a red herring or not, it's always going to come into the conversation. So it's very, very difficult. But I can tell you for a fact, I believe that Central and Eastern Europeans have the most crystal clear view of security. We've been telling all of you in Western Europe for 30 years that this is who they are. You haven't listened to us, and now we have to deal with it. And so this is a serious issue. At the same time, I'm a Bitcoiner. I want decentralized societies. I love all of this conversation. I love all of the history and talking the philosophy like this. But Europe has a problem because it's just structurally not together. We have different languages. We have a structural problem. And it seems that the solution, like you said, so France is, not going to war with Germany every 20 minutes. I don't think that's for us.
We still have 20 minutes.
Yeah, we have 20 minutes. I meant to say 20 years. France going to war with Germany. It seems that the solution that the European Union has tried to do this is to avoid all this is just to be the best regulator. That's their view, is that we are just going to regulate better than all the rest. And that's why I tried to say those stats at the beginning. Like, you can look at the market reality. People, capital flows to the places where it's most welcome. Europe has not necessarily proven that, and they certainly don't know what they're doing as far as it goes with a security budget. I mean, America pays for 80% of the NATO budget. I mean, what are we doing? Like, if we're going to actually take security seriously. But then again, we got anarchists and decentralized. Like, this is a tough topic to talk about at this conversation. I don't want to be too broad on that. But anyway, maybe I'll stop there.
Well, the securities is one thing, and I think we would agree that there is a reason why America is paying for the NATO budget. They also have interests in keeping their own influence over Europe. Of course, but the other thing is regulation, right? Regulation is something nobody likes to talk about. It's always boring, and then somebody in Brussels, comes up with 200 pages of regulation. Now we have MiCA, the markets in crypto regulation. And what's so interesting, and Matthew, I hope you've looked into this a little bit. What's so interesting is this different approach in regulation. So Europe now is patting itself on the back because we now have a crypto regulation. Yeah. And like 5 minutes later, the US is starting to actually go against so-called crypto securities. We see the SEC is now acting against Binance, against Coinbase, and specifically altcoins, right? While we in Europe, we don't differentiate between Bitcoin and altcoins. So where are we heading there?
Yeah, well, just before we go on a big thing about regulation, again, I try to let's keep it with the markets and actually what's happening. I didn't mention banking earlier. I talked about, oil and gas, mining, tech. European banks are not looking good, right? We saw what happened with Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank. Okay, these banks have trillions of dollars of assets, trillions of dollars, but their market caps are in the billions. Deutsche Bank is a $20 billion company. 20 years ago, it was a $60 billion company. Societe Generale, it's a $20 billion company by market cap. 20 years ago, it was a $100 billion company. And I'm not cherry picking just before the financial crisis. That was well before, 20 years ago. And obviously we see what happened with Credit Suisse. So if you want to talk about, the future, it's clear that these guys are going to have a rough go. Another thing to say about the KYC regulation stuff, and I think this is actually more relevant than I don't know, going back and forth, not to dodge your question too much, but I want to talk about the KYC as well, because this is something we've dealt with in Eastern Europe long ago, all right, for 10 years now. Again, because we've had Russian money laundered through the Baltics for 30 years. And a lot of it is really, really dirty money, like, mafia and all that stuff. But we've been dealing with KYC, AML, long before all this, and I'm not a fan of it. I'm not defending it. I'm not saying it's good. We had it for like 10, 15 years, really hardcore. Show us the source of your funds, show us all of this stuff. And you'd still have every other month, the Baltic Bank would have some, scandal of laundering Russian money. So, also, we didn't particularly want to integrate some of those regulations, but the reason we did is because the banks are Swedish. And the Swedes like to do that. So, so we're dealing with all of those things as well. My point is, I don't see any salvation in any of these regulations. And it's funny, Swedbank, SEB, these big Swedish banks, they were the most draconian about Bitcoin 10 years ago. Closing down accounts in 2012, 2013, the most draconian. And now, what I see in Eastern Europe is, and my Latvian friends I guess I should say Northern Europe now. We like to be Northern Europe. But anyway, Northeastern Europe, the banks are just realizing they have to offer services. Everybody is inquiring about Bitcoin. You cannot avoid it. So it's actually amazing to see. We were the most hardcore about all this KYC, bad regulation, well before what you think you're seeing now about this KYC and stuff that's going on with the US and everything. Well before we were dealing with that. And now they have no choice but to offer Bitcoin because clients are demanding it. So this is, I think, the real tea leaves that you can see what's going to happen in the future.
But that is a good segue, Ioni. Are Swedish banks offering Bitcoin now? Is that true?
They're opening it up, becoming more friendly is what I mean.
Okay.
Specific services in the works, but yeah.
So about a year ago, or maybe 1.5, maybe 2 years ago, I was trying to make a Bitcoin purchase. I was selling fiat for Bitcoin, and my bank did not let me. I made a tweet about this, declaring that I consider this an act of war. And I had a back and forth with my bank, and they simply would not let me buy Bitcoin. I threatened to switch banks, and after about a month of back and forth, they let me.
Interesting.
So things actually changed. And I think this was right in the middle of they undergoing a policy change. So we are seeing things change. The banks are, I don't think that they are endorsing Bitcoin.
No.
Not yet, but they are still much more lenient than they were just a few years ago. And that's an important change. Now that I have the word, should I go on?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Well, we are going to, I'm telling you, we have 12 more minutes left. What we want to talk about is the positive aspects of, or how do we get into an optimistic and positive future for Europe. I think that you have 3 different viewpoints on that, so that's good.
I think we have 3 different viewpoints, and that's good. By the way, I didn't really hear a contradiction from you, Rahim. I think we're on the same page, just looking at things differently. I'm not saying balkanization is a good thing. I'm saying it can happen in a good way, but not necessarily, and historically it has been a difficult change for a lot of people. Anyway, still looking to the future, people think that we are in the early stages of the digital age, and we are not. We're in the very beginning of it. The interfaces that we have to cyberspace right now are screens, are keyboards, and apparently...
Well, we have an Apple thing now. We have the Apple Glass.
Apparently ski masks as well. Yeah. So the interfaces that we have right now, they will soon be relics of a bygone era. Even our computer brain interfaces are, that's not the end of it, that's the beginning of it. We will design, we will come up with new kinds of interfaces to cyberspace that we cannot even fathom today. And we're dematerializing society, right? Everything that can be put into cyberspace will be put into cyberspace. That said, everything that we can put into cyberspace is not going to disappear from the physical world. We're still going to have friends in cyberspace. We're still going to have friends in the physical world. And I think that is an important note to make. And we're building infrastructure in cyberspace, but not just to make us as a society more efficient. We are actually colonizing cyberspace. We are building the future of our civilization in cyberspace. And I think Asgardia, as I mentioned, the micronation that aims to be the first space-based nation, is a pretty cool project, but wait until we see sovereign states in cyberspace. And here I want to, and I think that these are not only going to be developed, I think that they're already underway.
That's what would be like Bilagi's idea of a network state, right?
Yeah, exactly. Balaji's, his definition, he popularized the term the network state. And his definition, I think, is something I like along the lines of a highly online community with the capacity for collective action. And I think that Bitcoin, the Bitcoin network, is at least the seed to the first network state, if it already isn't. It could become a nation state or a sovereign state project within cyberspace with its own citizens, obviously, its own money, probably its own constitutions as well. And this is very exciting for the future, because we are, as a group, we are leading the way to a different kind of society where we see the rise of micronations also in cyberspace, and I think that is very fascinating.
I think
you want to jump in.
I think what you're saying is, and I think that everybody who's here will have experienced this within the next couple of days, is that that Bitcoiners as a social network operate very differently to other, let's say, social networks, especially when it comes to where you come from, etc. It's more like funny stories, but people start caring less about nationalities, about national politics. Even I stopped caring about that stuff.
Yeah,
right?
Bitcoin citadels, whether in the physical world or in cyberspace, like micronations, they unite people based on shared ideals. Rather than traditional things like borders, state currencies, and language. So it's an entirely new way of, an entirely new fundamental, like a new basis for forming a nation or a state or a sovereign state project. I'm not sure what the right terminology is going to be. It's probably going to change. Yeah.
Rahim, can Bitcoin be the basis for the first digital network state? Is there a historical precedent for something like this?
Yes, there is, but not really for the idea of the network state. I'm more skeptical about that. It's meant to be a digital, intentional community. It's like we all Bitcoiners get together online, we have the same forum, and then somehow we gather and then create our micronation.
But what if it's not intentional? What if it just happens, like we see, communities coming together right now?
I think much more important is the technologies, the infrastructures, the protocol. And that's where Bitcoin has power. I'm sorry, I got to pitch my lecture tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll do a historic deep dive on what I think are the analogies in the past of these kind of layered technologies and what may be a future coming out of Bitcoin. So I think the potential future and the appeal and impact of Bitcoin is really to be this kind of protocol for a network of savings. But it's not really like intentional in the sense that people share exactly the same belief structure, and that intrinsically motivates them to scale towards a city-state. That's not how I see city-states emerging. Usually it's really people that are more diverse, have diverse ends, and meet because they share the same means for their ends, and they find technological solutions, they find protocol solutions that really work, and they adopt them, and then it becomes a layer that's independent of the institutions we have and the failing institutions. That's really the promise of Bitcoin. It's one of the reasons why events like that, and what you referred to, Niko, as like the social community of Bitcoiners tends to be much more positive, because we're experiencing that. Most of us are doubtful, skeptic, disillusioned about institutions, financial institutions, political institutions, and we see how something that started out to be ridiculed really gets a power on its own, and you don't have to argue and convince people.
Exactly.
In a sense, it's a self-driving adoption because it solves problems, it solves real problems. We are in a much too privileged part of the world to really experience those kind of problems, but they are real problems. That's, of course, the reason why in countries which have much less of that heritage that we would have as Europeans, it's maybe easier for us to understand the appeal and the impact if we were interested in our own history, but the problems are much more evident outside of Europe, so that's why we have most Bitcoin adoption places like Nigeria and Turkey and Venezuela.
But it's a different kind of adoption, right? Because when you, of course, when you look at the sum of the money invested and the number of nodes running and the number of miners running, it's still bigger in the West. So the adoption that you talk about is the, you know, I need this now to survive adoption, while we are doing the, I like this, it's cool, it's new, it's digital, it might even make me rich adoption, which is still true for most people. Let's not, you know, kid ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's crucial is the real customer need. It's for two reasons. One is a disciplining force, and it's more sustainable. Of course, we have a lot of distortion. We have a lot of distortion in venture capital. That's, of course, why crypto has blown up so much, and the altcoin thing. It's a highly distorted financial structure, which I wouldn't trust anymore. I don't think really venture capital is correlated that much to competence or sustainable business models anymore, and may even start to have the same negative correlation that we have in politics, which means a negative marginal return of your capital invested, of your money spent. That's why these real use cases are that important, not volume-wise, but as a disciplining element and like getting down to earth and figuring out where the future may be. So you have the chance, and of course then it's not equally distributed, and still people of European heritage play an outsized role in entrepreneurship and investing. And it's part of the cultural heritage that you get. I mean, you don't have to just take it over and increases. Most are consuming, so it's not racist thing or assumptions. I think you are, if you're open-minded, it's better to be in other parts of the planet. And I think the role the Europeans play, it's more and more outside of Europe, outside a small territory of Europe. And if it's Europe, it's a kind of network. It's like Prague is very important for the Bitcoin ecosystem, but not as a territory, as a node in a network. It's people going to Prague, liking the city, meeting other people, and you have the network effects of people running into each other, starting businesses, and then a track record that we've heard about before, where you have accumulating returns.
Allow me to make a very quick point.
Yes,
here.
please. Quickly, please. So we only have 3 more minutes, and I want to give Matthew the chance to say something.
So throughout humanity, we have been united by different kinds of stories, right? And these stories have evolved to be able to hold more and more people. We began as hunter-gatherers in small bands of up to maybe 30 people. Then we became settlers, and we introduced the Dunbar number, basically. And as we began to industrialize, and or in our late stages as farmers, we developed religions, ideologies, and these were very powerful stories to unite humanities in very large groups. So industrialization could unite millions of people, and religions and ideologies could unite even more people. But I think that the Bitcoin story is even more powerful. I think the Bitcoin story, which is essentially borderless censorship money that is neutral and fair money without third parties. This is a very simple but incredibly powerful story that could unite billions of people, and that could become like a separate kind of sovereign state project in cyberspace as well. I mean, there is an overlap, like you said, Rahim. Yeah.
So, and I want to give this to all of 3 of you, but we don't have much time. I'll start with Matthew. Do you think that when you've been in this space for a long time, actually, do you see, you know, basically Bitcoin changing the way people think and interact with each other? Because there is a social layer there that is very hard to grasp, but it is there, right?
Yes, we are going to win. As Bitcoiners, we are going to win. The legacy system is falling apart. I've tried to tell you that. We are going to win. I would just say demand from your centralized services on and off ramps into Bitcoin and then immediately withdraw your coins. Tell your friends to do that. Promote the positive ethos. I do think, as an Eastern, Northeastern European, we have a security problem in Europe. I do think that. But that goes back to how we're going to solve that collectively, nation state. I can't answer that right now. But we are going to win as far as sound money directing the future. Withdraw your coins.
Excellent. Ioni, you think we're going to win?
Yes, Satoshi discovered a new fundamental property of the universe, which is this the absolute mathematical scarcity, and he used it to deploy the Bitcoin network, and it is the seed for the future of our civilization. It is a new start, and we are absolutely going to win. There is no doubt about it. We have now this discovery that is an unstoppable force in society, and we're using it to meme ourselves to a new global economy and the first network state.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for kicking off Bitcoin Prague 2023 with me. It was an honor. And to all of you, thank you for being here and have a great time in Prague.